Some nights change everything, though they begin like any other. This is the story of a girl who believed she was meant to remain unseen. In the moment the world decided otherwise, Rosie Bennett had soil under her fingernails and peace in her heart. At 24, she had found her place among the orchids and ferns of Westbrook Botanical Gardens, a massive greenhouse on the edge of the city where she worked 6 days a week. Her life was measured in seasons and watering schedules, and the quiet satisfaction of watching something fragile become strong. She lived in a small studio apartment above a bakery, rode the bus to work before dawn, and had never imagined herself anywhere else. She was comfortable in her smallness, safe in her routine, invisible in the best possible way. That Tuesday evening, as Rosie wiped down workbenches and locked the propagation room, she had every intention of going home, heating leftover soup and reading until sleep found her. But Nadia Park had other plans. Nadia worked in the greenhouse gift shop, and while Rosie nurtured plants, Nadia nurtured chaos. She was bold where Rosie was careful, loud where Rosie whispered, and utterly convinced that life was meant to be lived at full volume. "Absolutely not," Rosie said, when Nadia cornered her near the specimen orchids, holding up a garment bag like a peace offering. "I'm not going to some fancy gala. You know, I don't do those things." Nadia's expression shifted from playful to pleading. "Please, Rosie, my cousin canceled last minute and I can't show up alone. It's for the Hartwell Art Foundation. Free food, beautiful space, and I promise you can leave after an hour. Just keep me company. You won't have to talk to anyone." Rosie looked at her friend's hopeful face and felt her resistance crumbling. Nadia had covered her shifts when her father was dying, had sat with her through the grief, had never asked for anything in return. One uncomfortable evening seemed a small price for such friendship. 1 hour, Rosie agreed quietly, and I'm not wearing anything ridiculous. The dress Nadia brought was midnight blue, simple but elegant, the fitted bodice and flowing skirt that felt like water against Rosie's skin. She had never worn anything so beautiful. Standing in Nadia's bathroom, staring at her reflection, Rosie barely recognized herself. Her dark hair, usually pulled back in a practical bun, fell in soft waves around her shoulders. Nadia had insisted on minimal makeup, just enough to make Rosie's brown eyes stand out against her olive skin. "You look like you belong in a garden," Nadia said softly, adjusting the dress. "Like something rare that just bloomed." Rosie wanted to believe her, but doubt was a familiar companion. The Hartwell Foundation Gala was held at the Luminaire Hotel, a historic building downtown that Rosie had passed 1,000 times but never entered. Walking through the marble lobby felt like stepping into a different world. Crystal chandeliers scattered light like stars. Women in designer gowns glided past, their laughter musical and effortless. Men in tailored suits spoke in low voices about investments and acquisitions and things. Rosie didn't understand. She felt like an imposter immediately. "Breathe," Nadia whispered, linking their arms. "You belong here as much as anyone else." But Rosie didn't believe that. She believed in soil and water and patience. She believed in things that grew slowly, quietly, without demanding attention. This world of wealth and performance felt as foreign as another planet. They found a spot near the edge of the ballroom, close enough to observe, but far enough to avoid conversation. Rosie watched everything with the careful attention she gave to her plants. She noticed how some guests commanded attention, while others worked to earn it. She saw the performance of it all, the way people laughed too loud at jokes that weren't funny, the way they name-dropped and networked and calculated their worth and connections. What struck her most was the staff. Servers moved through the crowd like ghosts, invisible to most guests. Rosie caught the eye of a young woman carrying a tray of champagne glasses and smiled. The woman looked surprised, then smiled back gratefully. Rosie had been invisible long enough to recognize it in others. Across the ballroom, though she didn't know it yet, someone was watching her. Julian Frost stood near the bar, a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand. At 38, he had attended more charity events than he could count. As a major donor to the Hartwell Foundation, his presence was expected, his contributions substantial, his interest in the actual proceedings minimal. He funded the arts because his late mother had loved them, because it was the right thing to do, because his wealth needed purpose. but he had grown weary of the spectacle. Then he saw her, a young woman in a blue dress, standing at the edge of everything trying to disappear. She wasn't networking or posing for photos. She wasn't checking her phone or scanning the room for important people. She was simply watching, present but apart. And when she smiled at a passing server, the gesture was so genuine it made his chest tighten. Julian had built a career on reading people. He could spot ambition, greed, and desperation from across any room. But this woman radiated something different. Contentment, perhaps. Or honesty. Or the kind of quiet strength that comes from knowing exactly who you are. He asked a foundation coordinator who she was. The woman checked her guest list and shrugged. Rosie Bennett. +1 for Nadia Park, one of our gift shop partners. Why? Julian didn't answer. He simply watched as Rosie laughed at something her friend said. As she straightened her posture when she felt self-conscious, as she existed in a world designed to make people like her feel small, the evening progressed with speeches and toasts. Dinner was served courses that looked like art and tasted like money. Rosie ate slowly, unused to such richness. Nadia kept up a steady stream of whispered commentary about the guests, making Rosie smile despite her discomfort. Then Mrs. Helena Worth, the foundation's director, took the stage. She was a woman in her 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes. Wearing a burgundy gown that spoke of old money and good taste. "Tonight," she began, her voice clear and warm, "we celebrate not just art, but the people who help it flourish. Every year, the Hartwell Foundation awards a special scholarship for continuing education to someone who embodies our values: creativity, dedication, and quiet excellence." Rosie's attention drifted. Scholarships were for students, for ambitious people with plans and dreams. She returned her focus to her dessert. This year's recipient was nominated by one of our most generous donors, Mrs. Worth continued. Someone who witnessed her kindness, her integrity, and her passion for nurturing growth in all its forms. Rosie felt Nadia stiffen beside her. The Hartwell Foundation Scholarship is awarded to Miss Rosie Bennett. The room blurred. Sound became distance. Rosie was certain she had misheard. That another Rosie Bennett existed somewhere in this ballroom. Someone accomplished and deserving, and nothing like her. But faces turned toward her. Hundreds of eyes finding her in the crowd. Applause began, polite and curious, building to something that felt overwhelming. "Rosie," Nadia whispered, gripping her hand. "They said your name. There's been a mistake," Rosie managed, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Worth smiled directly at her. "Miss Bennett, would you please join me?" The walk to the stage felt impossible. Every step carried the weight of 1,000 doubts. Her hands trembled. Her breath came shallow. She could feel judgment in the whispers, questions in the stares. Who is she? What makes her special? Why her? She didn't know either, but she kept walking, because turning back felt like confirming every fear she'd ever had about herself. When she reached the stage, Mrs. Worth took her hand gently. "Breathe, dear. You're exactly where you're meant to be." Rosie looked out at the sea of faces and thought about her father, who had taught her that the most beautiful things grow in the quiet places, unseen until they're ready. Maybe, just maybe, she was finally ready to be seen. The applause faded into expectant silence, and Rosie stood beneath the chandelier light, feeling more exposed than she had ever felt in her life. Her throat was dry. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Mrs. Worth stood beside her, a reassuring presence. But even that couldn't quiet the voice in Rosie's head screaming that this was all a terrible mistake. "I think," Rosie whispered. Leaning toward Mrs. Worth, "there's been some confusion. I didn't apply for anything." Mrs. Worth's smile was patient and knowing. "The Hartwell Scholarship doesn't require an application, dear. It requires only that someone see you clearly." She gestured toward the audience, and someone did. From the crowd, a figure rose. Julian Frost moved with quiet confidence, his tall frame cutting through the sea of tables. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him perfectly. But what struck Rosie most was his face. No arrogance lived there, no performance. Just a calm steadiness that somehow made her feel less alone on that vast stage. He climbed the steps and nodded. respectfully to Mrs. Worth before turning to address the room. His voice was deep but gentle, carrying without effort. 6 months ago, Julian began, I visited Westbrook Botanical Gardens for a donor meeting. I arrived early and wandered the greenhouses to pass the time. That's where I first saw Miss Bennett, though we never spoke that day. Rosie's mind raced backward. 6 months ago. She remembered no such visit, no moment of significance. Just another ordinary day among her plants, Julian continued, his gaze settling on her briefly before returning to the audience. I watched her work with the care most people reserve for things they believe are watching back. But what stayed with me happened near the tropical section. A mother and her daughter were visiting. The girl was maybe 7, upset about something, crying. Her mother looked exhausted, overwhelmed, Miss Bennett noticed. The memories surfaced slowly. Rosie did remember. A little girl with braids and tear-stained cheeks, angry because her parents were divorcing, feeling powerless and small. The mother had apologized, embarrassed, trying to rush the child out. Miss Bennett knelt down, Julian said, and she showed that little girl a Venus flytrap. She explained how something so small could be so strong, how it didn't need to be big or loud to matter, how it caught what it needed by simply being itself. She turned a child's pain into wonder. She did it without hesitation, without audience, without any expectation of recognition. That's when I knew. Rosie's eyes burned with unexpected tears. She had forgotten that interaction entirely. It had seemed so insignificant, just a moment of kindness in a long day. The Hartwell Foundation supports people who nurture growth in others, Julian explained. Miss Bennett does this every day, not because it advances her career or earns her status, but because she understands something fundamental that many of us forget. Small acts of attention can change everything. She deserves the chance to grow herself. The room absorbed this in silence. Some faces showed genuine warmth. Others displayed polite skepticism. A few, like Trevor Lang, Julian's business associate, seated near the front, wore expressions of thinly veiled doubt. Mrs. Worth stepped forward, holding an elegant folder. The scholarship provides full tuition for any accredited program of study, plus a mentorship component with foundation partners, and a modest living stipend for 2 years. Miss Bennett, this is yours if you choose to accept it, she chose. The words hung in the air. This wasn't something being forced upon her. It was being offered, which somehow made it more terrifying. Accepting meant believing she deserved it. Accepting meant stepping out of the safety of her small life. Accepting meant risking failure in front of everyone. I don't understand, Rosie said quietly, her voice shaking. I'm just a greenhouse worker. I didn't finish college. I'm not special. There must be hundreds of people more worthy of this. Julian's expression softened. Worthiness isn't a competition, Miss Bennett, and you've already proven yours. You just haven't been paying attention. Mrs. Worth touched Rosie's arm gently. Take your time, dear. You don't have to decide this moment. But know that you were chosen for exactly who you are, not who you think you should be. The applause returned warmer this time, and Rosie was guided off the stage in a daze. Nadia rushed to her side immediately, eyes shining with tears and pride. Did you know about this? Rosie asked. It's not a clue, Nadia said, hugging her fiercely. But I'm not surprised. Rosie, you're the best person I know. The fact that you can't see it just proves how genuine you are. The rest of the evening blurred. People approached her, some with congratulations, others with thinly veiled curiosity. Rosie smiled and thanked them, feeling like she was playing a role in someone else's story. She caught glimpses of Julian across the room, but he didn't approach again, giving her space to process. In the powder room, Rosie splashed cold water on her wrists, trying to ground herself. That's when she heard the voices from the lounge area just beyond the door. It's a publicity stunt, a woman's voice said dismissively. Julian Frost needs good press after that merger controversy. What better way than discovering some humble working girl? She does seem rather ordinary, another voice agreed. I mean, a greenhouse worker? What could she possibly contribute to the foundation's prestige? Rosie froze, her reflection in the mirror showing every insecurity she'd tried to hide. The bathroom door swung open and Nadia stormed in, fire in her eyes. She had clearly heard the conversation too. "Don't you dare listen to them," Nadia said fiercely. "Those women have had everything handed to them their entire lives. They wouldn't recognize real worth if it bloomed in their perfectly manicured hands." "But what if they're right?" Rosie whispered. "What if this is just charity? What if I embarrass myself trying to be something I'm not?" Nadia gripped her shoulders. "You're not trying to be anything. That's the whole point. You were chosen for being exactly who you are. Those women, they perform their entire lives and still nobody really sees them. You exist honestly and someone finally noticed. That's not charity, Rosie. That's recognition." But doubt had taken root, and Rosie felt it spreading through her chest like frost. She needed air. She slipped out a side door and found herself in a courtyard garden, a small oasis of green in the middle of the hotel. The night was cool. The city sounds distant. She sat on a stone bench among the planters and let herself breathe. "I thought I might find you here." Julian's voice was quiet, non-intrusive. He stood several feet away, hands in his pockets, not approaching without permission. "Among the plants," Rosie said with a weak smile. "Predictable, honest," he corrected gently. He gestured to the bench. "May I?" She nodded, and he sat, leaving space between them. For a long moment, they simply existed in the silence, listening to the fountain and the distant traffic. "I heard what those women said." Julian finally spoke. "For what it's worth, they're wrong." "Are they?" Rosie turned to face him. "Be honest. Is this about me, or about how helping me makes you look?" She expected him to be offended, but he just nodded slowly. "That's a fair question. The answer is complicated. Yes, it reflects well on me and the foundation. Yes, it will generate positive attention. But those are consequences, not motivations. I nominated you because watching you that day reminded me why I started supporting the arts in the first place. I don't understand." "Not a clue," Nadia said, hugging her fiercely. "But I'm not surprised. Rosie, you're the best person I know. The fact that you can't see it just proves how genuine you are." The rest of the evening blurred. People approached her, some with congratulations, others with thinly veiled curiosity. Rosie smiled and thanked them, feeling like she was playing a role in someone else's story. She caught glimpses of Julian across the room, but he didn't approach again, giving her space to process. In the powder room, Rosie splashed cold water on her wrists, trying to ground herself. That's when she heard the voices from the lounge area, just beyond the door. "It's a publicity stunt," a woman's voice said dismissively. "Julian Frost needs good press after that merger controversy. What better way than discovering some humble working girl?" "She does seem rather ordinary," another voice agreed. "I mean, a greenhouse worker? What could she possibly contribute to the foundation's prestige?" Rosie froze, her reflection in the mirror showing every insecurity she'd tried to hide. The bathroom door swung open, and Nadia stormed in, fire in her eyes. She had clearly heard the conversation too. "Don't you dare listen to them," Nadia said fiercely. "Those women have had everything handed to them their entire lives. They wouldn't recognize real worth if it bloomed in their perfectly manicured hands." "But what if they're right?" Rosie whispered. "What if this is just charity? What if I embarrass myself trying to be something I'm not?" Nadia gripped her shoulders. "You're not trying to be anything. That's the whole point. You were chosen for being exactly who you are. Those women, they perform their entire lives and still nobody really sees them. You exist honestly, and someone finally noticed. That's not charity, Rosie. That's recognition." But doubt had taken root, and Rosie felt it spreading through her chest like frost. She needed air. She slipped out a side door and found herself in a courtyard garden, a small oasis of green in the middle of the hotel. The night was cool, the city sounds distant. She sat on a stone bench among the planters and let herself breathe. "I thought I might find you here." Julian's voice was quiet, non-intrusive. He stood several feet away, hands in his pockets, not approaching without permission. "Among the plants," Rosie said with a weak smile. "Predictable. Honest," he corrected gently. He gestured to the bench. "May I?" She nodded, and he sat, leaving space between them. For a long moment, they simply existed in the silence, listening to the fountain and the distant traffic. "I heard what those women said," Julian finally spoke. "For what it's worth, they're wrong. Are they?" Rosie turned to face him. "Be honest. Is this about me, or about how helping me makes you look?" She expected him to be offended, but he just nodded slowly. "That's a fair question. The answer is complicated. Yes, it reflects well on me and the foundation. Yes, it will generate positive attention. But those are consequences, not motivations. I nominated you because watching you that day reminded me why I started supporting the arts in the first place. I don't understand." Julian looked up at the sliver of sky visible between the buildings. "My mother was a botanist. She taught at a small university and spent her weekends volunteering at community gardens in struggling neighborhoods. She had offers from prestigious institutions, opportunities for advancement, but she chose to stay where she felt she could make the most difference. She died when I was 16, and I inherited everything she had worked to avoid: money, status, expectation. I've spent 20 years trying to honor her by funding things that matter. But somewhere along the way, it became transactional. Write a check, attend an event, move on. Until I saw you with that little girl and I remembered what my mother taught me, that the most important work happens in small moments, witnessed by no one, performed by people who do it simply because it's right." Rosie felt something shift in her chest. "I'm not your mother," no, he agreed. "But you remind me that people like her still exist, and they deserve support, not because they'll become famous or profitable, but because their way of being in the world makes it better. That's not charity. That's investment in what matters." "I'm afraid," Rosie admitted quietly. "I'm afraid I'll waste this opportunity. That I'll discover I'm not smart enough or talented enough. That everyone will realize I don't belong." Julian was quiet for a moment. "Can I tell you what I see when I look at you?" She nodded, uncertain. "I see someone who has spent her whole life making herself small to avoid disappointment. Someone who convinced herself that not wanting more meant she didn't deserve more. I see someone capable of extraordinary things who has never been given permission to try. This scholarship isn't about making you into someone else. It's about giving you resources to become more fully yourself." Tears slipped down Rosie's cheeks before she could stop them. No one had ever seen her so clearly spoken to the exact fear that had kept her safe and small for so long. "What if I fail?" she whispered. "Then you'll have tried," Julian said simply, which is more than most people can say. "The question isn't whether you'll fail. The question is whether you'll let fear make your decisions for you, the way it's been doing your entire life." The words landed like stones in still water, rippling outward through everything Rosie thought she knew about herself. She'd been afraid for so long she'd forgotten it was a choice. That night, Rosie couldn't sleep. She sat by her window, watching the bakery below prepare for morning. The familiar rhythm of kneading and rising dough a comfort against her swirling thoughts. The scholarship folder sat on her small table, unopened, full of possibilities that terrified her. She thought about her father. Thomas Bennett had been a gardener at the same botanical gardens where Rosie now worked. He had spent 40 years tending other people's beauty, content in his craft, never asking for more. When he died 3 years ago, he left her nothing but his work ethic and a single piece of advice given on his deathbed. "Rosie girl," he had whispered, his weathered hands holding hers, "I lived a good life, but a small one. I was afraid to want more, afraid I didn't deserve it. Don't make my mistake. Every seed deserves the chance to grow. Even you. Especially you," he had meant. She had buried those words with him, too afraid to let them take root. But now, sitting in the pre-dawn darkness with Julian's question echoing in her mind, she felt them pushing through the soil of her fear. Was she really going to let her father's regret become her inheritance? Morning came, and with it, clarity. Rosie called Mrs. Worth and accepted the scholarship. Her voice shook, but her decision didn't. The foundation scheduled a small acceptance ceremony for the following week. A more intimate gathering where Rosie would officially receive the scholarship and speak briefly about her plans. Those 7 days passed in a blur of paperwork and possibility. She met with academic advisors, explored programs in botanical science and horticultural therapy, began imagining a future she had never let herself want. Nadia helped her choose an outfit for the ceremony. Something simple but confident. "You're not hiding anymore," her friend said firmly. "Own it." The acceptance ceremony was held at the Foundation Gallery, surrounded by art that cost more than Rosie would earn in a lifetime. 50 people attended, far fewer than the gala, but somehow more intimidating. These were Foundation board members, donors, people who expected her to be exceptional. She felt the old fear rising, the urge to apologize for taking up space. Then, she saw Julian standing near the back, and he gave her the smallest nod. Not encouragement, just acknowledgement. "You're here. That's enough." When it was time to speak, Rosie approached the microphone with notes she'd written and rewritten a dozen times. But standing there, looking out at expectant faces, she folded the paper and spoke from somewhere deeper. "I've been invisible my whole life," she began, her voice quiet but steady. "Not because anyone made me that way, but because I chose it. I chose it because being invisible meant being safe. If no one saw me, no one could judge me, reject me, or find me wanting. I could live my small life and tell myself I was content." She paused, gathering courage. But contentment and peace aren't the same thing. I was content because I had lowered my expectations until they fit the life I was too afraid to outgrow. I told myself I was happy among my plants because they didn't expect anything from me. They just grew, slowly and quietly, and I helped them. I never considered that I might need the same thing. Space to grow. Patience with my own pace. Someone to believe I was worth the effort. A few people shifted in their seats. This wasn't the grateful speech they'd expected. When Mr. Frost nominated me, I wanted to refuse. I wanted to explain that he'd made a mistake, that I wasn't special, that there were so many people more deserving. But the truth is, I wasn't worried about other people being more deserving. I was worried about proving I wasn't worthy. I was worried that if I tried and failed, it would confirm every fear I've ever had about myself. Rosie's hand steadied on the podium. My father was a gardener. He taught me everything I know about plants, about patience, about finding beauty in small things. But he also taught me something I didn't understand until recently. He showed me what happens when you're too afraid to grow beyond what feels safe. You survive, but you don't truly live. You watch other people bloom and tell yourself you're happy in the shade. Her voice grew stronger. I don't want to live in the shade anymore. I don't want to measure my worth by how little space I take up. I don't want to be so afraid of failing that I never try. So I'm accepting this scholarship not because I think I deserve it more than anyone else, but because I'm finally ready to believe I deserve it at all. The room was utterly silent. Rosie could see Mrs. Worth dabbing at her eyes. Julian's expression remained neutral, but something in his posture had softened. To anyone listening who has made themselves small, Rosie continued, who has convinced themselves that not wanting more is the same as having enough, who is afraid that reaching for something better means risking everything, I want you to know this. You are not invisible. You are not insignificant. Your quietness is not weakness. Your humility is not worthlessness. The world needs people who care more about doing good work than getting credit for it. But the world also needs those people to thrive, not just survive. She took a breath. I'm going to study horticultural therapy. I want to work with children and people who feel invisible the way I've felt. I want to teach them what my father taught me, what my plants have shown me, what this scholarship has given me permission to believe. That growth isn't about becoming someone else. It's about becoming more fully yourself. It's about taking up the space you need and trusting that you deserve the light. The applause that followed wasn't polite or performative. It was genuine, moved, the kind of response that comes from recognition rather than obligation. Several people approached afterward with their own stories of feeling invisible, of making themselves small, of needing permission to take up space. A woman in her 50s gripped Rosie's hand. I've been a secretary for 30 years, she said quietly. I've wanted to go back to school, but I kept telling myself I was too old, that it was selfish. Thank you for reminding me that I'm allowed to want more. A young man, barely 20, told her he'd dropped out of college because he felt like an imposter among wealthier students. But maybe I should try again, he said thoughtfully. Rosie realized something profound. Her vulnerability hadn't made her weak. It had made her accessible. By admitting her fears instead of hiding them, she had given other people permission to acknowledge theirs. Julian waited until the crowd dispersed before approaching. That wasn't the speech I expected, he said. I hope it was okay. It was honest, he replied. Which is worth more than okay. You didn't perform gratitude. You shared truth. That's rare, Rosie smiled. I'm still terrified, you know. This doesn't feel real yet. It will, Julian assured her. And when it does, when the fear comes back, remember that it's supposed to be there. Growth is uncomfortable. If it were easy, everyone would do it. Over the following weeks, Rosie began her studies. She enrolled in a program combining botany, psychology, and therapeutic practice. The classes challenged her, exposed gaps in her education, forced her to work harder than she ever had. There were moments when she wanted to quit, when the old voice whispered that she didn't belong, but there were also moments of profound joy. The first time she successfully propagated a rare orchid species. The first time she presented research to her class and saw understanding in their eyes. The first time a professor told her she had an intuitive grasp of plant biology that couldn't be taught. She wasn't just learning. She was becoming. Julian kept his distance, respectful of boundaries, but he checked in occasionally through the foundation. Their relationship remained professional, appropriate, defined by mutual respect rather than rescue. He had opened a door. She had chosen to walk through it. That was enough. 3 months into her program, the foundation asked if she would volunteer at a weekend workshop, teaching basic gardening to children from underserved neighborhoods. Rosie agreed immediately. She spent the morning showing 12 kids how to plant seeds, explaining that something so small could become something magnificent with patience and care. One girl, quiet and withdrawn, reminded Rosie of herself. The child barely spoke, staying at the edge of the group, clearly uncomfortable. Rosie knelt beside her. "What's your name?" she asked gently. "Mia," the girl whispered. "Do you like plants, Mia?" The girl shrugged. "I guess. I don't know much about them." Rosie handed her a small terracotta pot and a packet of sunflower seeds. "That's okay. Neither did I when I started. But I learned something important. Plants don't care if you're rich or poor, smart or struggling, confident or scared. They just need attention, patience, and someone who believes they'll grow. And then they do." Mia looked at the seeds in her palm. "What if I mess it up?" "Then you'll try again," Rosie said simply. "That's what I did. I messed up 100 times before I got it right. But every mistake taught me something. And you know what? The plants don't judge you for failing. They just keep trying to grow, and eventually they teach you how to help them." The girl planted her seeds carefully, and Rosie saw in her face the same hunger she had felt at the gala. The need to be seen, to matter, to believe she could be more than invisible. That evening, as Rosie cleaned up the workshop space, Mrs. Worth found her. "You're a natural at this," the older woman observed. "It doesn't feel like work," Rosie admitted. "It feels like what I'm supposed to be doing." Mrs. Worth smiled knowingly. "That's how you know you've found your purpose. Not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. Because you can't imagine not doing it. Julian saw that in you 6 months ago. I'm glad you're finally seeing it in yourself." Rosie thought about the girl she had been at the gala, terrified and small, convinced she didn't deserve attention. That girl wasn't gone. She still lived inside Rosie, still whispered doubts and fears. But she was no longer the only voice. There was a new voice now, stronger and steadier. Rooted in something Rosie had never allowed herself before, self-belief, not the kind that came from arrogance or comparison. The kind that came from trying, failing, learning, and trying again. The kind that came from being seen clearly and choosing to see herself the same way. As Rosie left the foundation that evening, walking past the art that had once intimidated her, she felt different. Not transformed into someone new, but revealed as someone who had always been there. a seed that had finally been given permission to grow, and she was just beginning to bloom.